Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about predictive analytics and what we could do by producing better predictions or better models of what might happen in the future. What's the future? That's what WTF stands for, isn't it? I think. I don't know if it stands for anything else. Looking at better data. So before I start and before people start tweeting, we are a neutral consultancy because one of the things I want to have a look at is Plan S and how we might be able to examine what Plan S might mean for our marketplace. I want to hasten to add, we don't take a particular advocacy point of view, either for or against. This is all about what the data might be telling us to inform the discussion, whichever side of it we may sit on. So the point about data is that it can be quite complicated to get hold of. But really, the aim of the game is to get us fairly simple insights based on those complicated tools. But before you do anything, you need quite good data to start with. And when it comes to market data in the STM market, I fear that we don't have brilliant data. So I'd like to start with an example from a different area of publishing. Now, very complicated chart in front of you. I will break it down and walk you through it, because the point of these things is to see what the simple picture is that the data is presenting to us. So what you're looking at here are total revenues from the US recorded music industry. The taller the bar, the more the money. Reading from left to right, this is progressing over time, 1973 on the left-hand side through to 2017 on the right-hand side. There's quite a lot going on here, but really we're looking at the overall patterns. And if you look at the far left, you'll see we start with the good old analog media in blue, that's vinyl and cassette. And we see that growing, and then at about a third of the way from the left, the mid-80s, we see the incoming orange CDs. And CDs really grew over time to completely dominate the market by about the middle of the chart, in about 2000. And then something happened called the internet, and things changed pretty rapidly after that. And if you follow things to the right-hand side of the chart, you'll see CDs dropped off to be replaced by purple downloads and green streaming media. Now, the couple of points about this chart. Number one, we're looking at actual revenues. So various competitive organizations are sharing their headline revenue data with, in this case, with the Recording Industry Association of America. They're aggregating that data, so they're not giving away individual positions, but when you map all this out, you can get a good pattern of what's happening in the marketplace and how different media are changing. Note, for example, that most recently, there's very little orange CD left compared with the dominance of the green streaming services. So this overall picture paints a real change, or a picture of change in the marketplace over the last few years. The other comment about this is how recent it is. 2017 is the most recent data here, and this was published, I think, within about month number 4 of 2018. And if you think it usually takes a couple of months for year-end accounts to land, it's pretty recent data. So the closest equivalent for STM then is this. I will talk you through the chart again. What we are measuring here is total numbers of scholarly articles. So point number one, as an industry, we don't pull data about our revenues. We'll talk about how we get there in a minute. Again, we're reading left to right time, starting 2009 on the left-hand side through to 2018 on the right-hand side. In this chart, the different color, well, all of the lines show the same thing. The different colors simply represent when that same thing was looked at. So the red line is how much stuff we thought we were producing in 2016. The same question asked again in 2017 yielded the yellow line, and then again the green line. The point being, if you look at, let's say, 2016's data there, that should be the same number, but depending on when you measured it, you can get a 14% variation in this particular data source. So to my point, I don't think we're necessarily that good at gathering information about our own industry's output. I have deliberately not put a source on here, because in the spirit of neutrality, I didn't want to risk being perceived of criticizing any particular source. Pretty well every major index will suffer from this sort of problem, and they'll all suffer to it with a similar order of magnitude. So the point is, I think we have a system-wide challenge when it comes to really understanding how our market's moving. Now, the only way to solve that challenge is to start to apply some, quote, data science, unquote, techniques to it. So you can all breathe now. I promise you, you don't have to look at maths. You can look at the kitten instead, and I'll talk you through what the maths actually means. Really, there's three things that we've got to do. Number one, when we get fairly imperfect data, we need to apply some mathematical techniques to look at underlying trends. That's what the previous slide was all about. The second thing is we often need multiple data sets so we can sort of triangulate a realistic view of things. And then finally, what we do at Delta Think is we survey individual publishing organizations so we can find out how what they say is actually happening is squaring with what the indexes think is happening, and we can therefore improve our models. So, what does this actually mean for us with Plan S? I'm going to make the brash assumption that everyone here knows what Plan S is, so we can dive in. Now, the first thing is we've got to decide what data we're going to measure. And when Plan S was first announced, I think one of the press releases mentioned that the 11 founding funders together managed 8.8 billion euros of funding, or 7.9 billion US dollars of funding. So that might be an initial number to look into. However, if you compare that with the estimated $2.2 trillion spent, in this case in 2017, $2.2 trillion spent globally on research and development, I think that amount of funding is just a tiny, tiny slice of the market and is perhaps not entirely relevant for our analysis. However, if you take the number of articles published by authors funded by the Plan S funders, you get a more significant amount. And to get to this is where we had to bring together multiple data sets and do also work to model this out. So, diving into that a bit more, and I do want to give a particular thanks to Digital Science and their Dimensions product. They were one of a number of data sets we used, but they were particularly helpful in helping us to get a handle on what was going on here. We also pulled data from the National Science and Engineering Indicators, from R&D magazine to look at total funding globally, and so on and so forth. There's a whole bunch of things we brought together. But basically, the headline is we think that around about 3.5% of globally produced scholarly articles are funded by Plan S funders. In other words, one author or more is funded by a Plan S funder, and that includes the most recent signatories to the Coalition S. So that includes Wellcome and Gates and so forth. We did some other modelling. There's a difference between share of all articles published and the equivalent proportion for global open access output. OA slightly higher, because I think a lot of those funders tend to be at the vanguard of open access funding. And then we also took a view of, well, what might happen if Plan S starts to grow? So, for example, the current list of signatories does not include Germany. However, I suggest it might not be a huge stretch to suggest that Germany might come on board at some point soon. So when we started to model this stuff out, we wanted to layer different scenarios into our model so we could take a view of what this might mean for us going forward. So going forward, we want to project all this stuff over time. So we have another time chart for you here. Again, reading left to right, this time we're starting in 2018. And trying to trend out our models to see what might happen by 2025. Usual disclaimers apply. This is a model. We're looking for trends in this, so please don't buy any shares based on my recommendations, I hasten to add. And then the next thing we want to do is say what might be the effects on the market. So what we do, top line, is we take the market's growth, if you will, as normal, as being 0% change. And then we want to model, will the market be worth more, moving up the chart, or worth less, moving down the chart, under certain scenarios. So this is just looking at a percentage change in projected value. So we trended out what might happen if Plan S kicked in, the authors funded by it can no longer pay APCs to hybrid journals, and they instead switch those APCs to their fully open access pricing equivalents. And we see that there's basically a little bit of a softening in the market going forward. The dip in 2020 is just to do with how we see the dynamics of pricing changing. But basically, overall, we think that Plan S will have a slight softening on the marketplace. And just to give you a sense of scale, the bottom thick black line is a minus 1% change. And so by about 2025, we think the market might have softened by about 0.6%. Okay? The next thing then is to say, well, okay, we know that moving to fully open access journals is one scenario, but another way that authors could be compliant is to switch to basically no APCs at all. Now, to one of our earlier sessions, our assumption here is that Plan S will permit a green option on hybrid journals. Right, we haven't modeled out what happens if the whole hybrid world collapses. We're simply saying what would happen if the APCs that would have been paid for fully open access journal, for hybrid journals rather, just disappear. And of course, we then see a more profound softening in the marketplace, reducing by about 0.8% against projected value in 7 or 8 years' time. And then finally, we modeled a scenario that said, what would happen if Plan S spread? And those are now 14 funders, is it? 13 funders moved to encompass the whole of the EU. And so if we project those uptake rates out, we get a much more significant softening of the market down to about minus 1.6% in 7 years' time or so. So this is a sense of what we're trying to do by gathering data, developing models, projecting it forward, to try and take a quantitative view of what might this mean for us. And we'd hope that this can therefore inform the Plan S conversation, which I'm sure most of you will have observed is very much qualitative at the moment. What these numbers mean are going to depend on your perspective. They're system-wide, so although these numbers are relatively modest in terms of change, of course, a particular publisher may be affected more profoundly depending on their portfolio, their existing models, and their position on all this. And we'd love to do more detailed studies of digging into what these sorts of scenarios might mean under more specific conditions. But to do that, we need more data, and this is where we need your help in terms of sharing it. Just one final observation in the last couple of minutes. In general, does this kind of data stuff matter going forward? And I would posit that I think we might increasingly see these sorts of data-driven approaches used in negotiations. And just a couple of examples. In the spirit of neutrality, I will show you sort of 2 points of view. One, this is a screenshot of a web page from Elsevier's website, used with kind permission. Thank you very much, Elsevier. It's a site, 5 surprising facts about open access. In their second fact, they present a chart which is of interest on the right-hand side there, which is really advocating that they suggest their APCs are quite good value for money. And they're comparing their average APC with average impact for their journals, and drawing that comparison with some other publishers in the space, and that's what the blobs are saying. So the point is, we're seeing a publisher using this sort of approach, and then I think we're also going to see some of the buyers of publisher service use this approach as well. I dare say most of you are aware of ESAC, which is now, I think, being run by the Max Planck Digital Library. This is a collection of web pages that are really gathering common approaches to negotiation. The point being, I think they look pretty slick. I think they're using data science techniques behind the scenes. So really, to make the point, I think that data will increasingly find its way into negotiations. We do this sort of analysis as well. I'm not going to dwell on this chart, but this is testing some of those Elsevier assumptions. So with that, I'd like to wrap up. We're trying to tackle the challenges of gathering multiple data sources, bringing them together and trying to make sense of them. It's not an easy task. We've quite often heard from publishers, well, I can just get my EA to look something up. It's actually a little bit more involved than that. If you want to find out more, please get in touch with me or one of my colleagues. And finally, we do have some free newsletters that we put out, which actually replicate some of these studies. So you can have a look at the sort of things we're doing, and we'd love to hear more from you. And with that, I will thank you very much for your time.